Hi, everyone. Welcome to your lecture on strategies for revision. Today, we're going to talk about the revision stage of the writing process as well as editing and how those two things are different. We'll look at what you should tackle first in your revision process. How do you take the feedback from me and from your peers and apply it to your essay? And why this is such an important step in the writing process. You'll have lots of feedback to consider from me on all of your essays, plus from your peers if you go to the writing center and your own revision. So this lesson will hopefully help you blend all of that feedback and get yourself on track for a stellar final paper. So revising versus editing. A lot of times these are used interchangeably, and these are not really synonyms. Revising is quite literally, seeing something again, whereas editing is kind of picking it apart, looking for, the minor things. So revising involves what we call higher order concerns, things like thesis statements, the focus of the paper, is the paper organized, the structure, the audience, who are you writing for, making sure that that's addressed, as well as the development of ideas. So this is the first step before you go into picking apart your paper for commas and periods and, all that little stuff. Those are called lower order concerns. Things like grammar, spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, word choice. So those are two different phases of the writing process. So we think about, why are the higher order concerns called higher order concerns? They have to be revised first, because if you go through and you correct all your commas and your punctuation and your spelling, and then you have to add more, or you have to move things around or take things out, then all of that editing was for nothing. If you do all of the editing first, it's going to end up being a waste of your time if you don't do the revising step first. So that's what we're really going to dig into today, is the difference of those two steps. So higher order concern one is thesis and focus. By this point of you watching this video, hopefully you've heard me really drill into you why the thesis statement is so important. Your paper should have a thesis. If your paper doesn't have a thesis, that's like number one thing that needs to be revised. Then you want to look at, is my thesis clear? Is it in the right place? Is it the last sentence of my introduction? Is it argumentative? And is it setting up the rest of my paper? Is it acting as that roadmap? And then you want to make sure that the whole paper is focused around that thesis statement. So this is going to be you reading the thesis and then reading through your paper, making sure that that focus is maintained throughout the entire paper. A lot of times when we're starting to write, especially if you don't use an outline, if you use an outline, you can probably mitigate a lot of straying from the thesis, which happens. If you're not an outline person, I do require students to do it, but if you have more of like a sketch outline, once you start writing, you might drift off or something might not seem relevant. That's all under this first higher order concern. So again, I kind of have these in a specific order because if your paper's not focused, everything else that you do isn't going to matter. So you really want to make sure you're tackling the thesis and the focus first, and then diving into the rest of these. The next one's going to be audience and purpose. So after you've established that your thesis is clear and maintained, does the paper have a clear purpose? So basically what that means is, like, why are you writing this? What's it intended to do or accomplish? If it doesn't seem like it has a purpose, then maybe there's an issue with your topic. In English 1, we really do a lot of work with topics, so hopefully this won't be a problem by the time you get to revising. But if you're in English 2, or if you are in another class and you're watching this, you always want to make sure that the paper has a purpose. What is it supposed to accomplish? And then you want to think about who your audience is. So we've talked about this, hopefully by this point, that your audience is an academic audience. So what are their expectations? What does an academic audience expect from your paper? They expect you to use quality sources. They expect you to explain those sources. They're expecting you to have developed ideas, right? So you want to consider that audience when you're writing. If you're using a lot of personal pronouns, if it's very informal, that might be something that needs to be fixed at this stage. You also want to think about, why would someone want to read this? Are you writing about something that's still relevant? If you're not, and again, if you're in 151, we've already addressed this, but if you're in another course, you don't want to write about something that's been written about a lot or that's not relevant anymore. And if you're writing about something that's been written about a lot, what's your unique angle that you're taking on that topic? And then making sure that lastly, your purpose matches the assignment. So again, in English 1, I do a lot of this for you by the way that the course is structured. But in another course, you may have to really think about that. If you're assigned to write, a persuasive essay, but you're not persuading anybody, then your purpose isn't matching what you're being asked to do. So you always want to double check that and make sure that your reason for writing is matching the assignment that you were given by the instructor. Next is going to be organization. So we have our focus, we have our audience and our purpose. Now we need to make sure our paper is organized. And there's a lot that goes into this. That's why there's a lot on this slide. You want to make sure that your paper is progressing logically through the ideas. So a lot of times when we're starting out with our 3-pronged thesis, we may not know what order that stuff needs to be in. As you're writing, that may become more clear, and you might need to move some things around. Just make sure that if you move around ideas within the paper, that you move them in the thesis and vice versa. If you move things in the thesis, make sure you move them in the paper, because that thesis is the roadmap. If you're not following the order presented in the thesis, that falls under this category. You want to make sure you're using transitions. Now at this level, again, depending on when you're listening to this, if you're starting out with your first paper in English 1, then you might use more basic transitions like, additionally or therefore or something at the beginning of every paragraph. As you're getting more sophisticated though, I want you to practice using full sentences to transition your ideas. You should start linking ideas at the end of each paragraph into what's coming next. Otherwise, your paper just appears as a bunch of isolated ideas. You also want to make sure your paragraphs are of appropriate length and that the lengths are varied. So a lot of times students want to know how many sentences in a paragraph. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish in that paragraph. Some paragraphs might be 4 sentences, some paragraphs might be 8 sentences. They don't all need to be the same. It doesn't need to be a cookie cutter type of essay. If it helps you, I usually say 4 to 7 sentences. It might be 8. If it goes beyond that, there might be either some straying from the idea in that paragraph or needs to be split into 2. But you just want to make sure that they are appropriate and varied. They don't all need to be exactly the same. You also want to make sure your introduction is predicting and outlining what the paper is going to discuss. Part of that is your thesis, right? The roadmap. Your introduction should not be irrelevant to the rest of your paper. If your whole introduction is just an anecdote but doesn't tell us what the actual paper is going to be about, that's another organizational issue that you may need to go back and revise. Make sure that your paper, the theme is very obvious, but that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A lot of people, they either forget the conclusion or, the conclusion is not really developed or it's very abrupt. You want to make sure that all of that is fully developed. That your conclusion wraps up the argument. I know me as a writer, conclusion is my weakness. It's something that I still struggle with, and I've written literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, probably thousands at this point of my life. And conclusions are always difficult for me. But just make sure that it is wrapping up your argument. A good way that at least I approach the conclusion, then I revise it, is think about what I learned from the assignment. Or what I learned from the research. What do you want your audience to take away from this? That's part of the organization as well. Your conclusion should not bring in any new information. There really shouldn't be citations there. You want to just wrap it up, not have it act as another body paragraph. So the next is development. This is our last higher order concern. This is one that, especially if you're still in the first draft of your paper, this is probably going to need some work. I know for me, I always end up going back and adding to my paragraphs. You want to make sure your paper is providing enough detail in your paragraph to sufficiently and effectively prove the point that you're trying to make. If your paragraph's just a topic sentence, a quote, and then one sentence of explanation, and then you're linking, there's probably not enough in that paragraph to have a fully developed point. So that explanation part of your paragraph is where it's going to vary a little bit, or evaluation, whatever you want to call it, that third part of your paragraph, the second E in the peel, that's where development needs to happen. It might also be in your linking ideas, right? That might need to be more developed. But you want to make sure that we're going beyond just definitions. I really don't want to see definitions in your paper. Definitions are considered common knowledge. I can go and look up a word if I need to know what that is. Or your reader, right? We're writing for an academic audience. If they don't know a word, they're going to go look it up. Make sure all of your paragraphs, again, have enough explanation. But also there may be some things you need to cut out. If your paper seems to be rambling, or if you're doing a peer review and your peer says that you kind of lost them, consider where you might need to take some things out. It's a less common problem than needing to add, but sometimes you have too much development for the scope of the assignment. And then go back through, and again, this is really good with peer review. Does anything seem unclear or unexplained? So if you're performing a peer review on someone's paper, if something's not clear to you, make sure you note that to the writer so that they know they need to explain that better, or they need to talk that out, that point out, or whatever it might be. Go through, because it's not going to seem unclear to you. It might seem unclear to somebody else, though. So that's why we do peer review. That's why I look at your paper. That's why I encourage you to go to the writing center. Okay, so those are our 4 major higher order concerns. There's lots of things, but those are really the big ones that you need to focus on. Once you've addressed all of that, now you have a brand new draft. So this would be your second draft. You have an outline on your first draft, you do the revision, then you have the second draft. And these really, you may not need to address all of these. It depends on where your strengths and weaknesses are as a writer. Some people have a harder time with the higher order concerns, but they're really good with grammar and those lower order things. And some people, it's the reverse. But you want to address all of those things first, and then you can move on to the editing that comes a little bit more naturally when we're doing a review of our paper or somebody else's paper. You can use spell check. Make sure you double check yourself. The spell check may not always catch things like homonyms, which are words that, look the same but might sound different, or vice versa, or, like there, and there, things like that. Make sure you're not misusing any words either. A lot of times we like to impress people with our vocabulary. I'm not about that life. I don't want you using the thesaurus feature unless, the word that you're looking for or the word that you're using really isn't capturing what you want to say. Then you can use that. But don't just go through your paper and use a bunch of big words. It's actually kind of a pet peeve of mine when people just litter a paper with big words just to show me that they can use them. I'm more concerned about the ideas in your paper. Highfalutin vocabulary was something that I was actually quite insecure about when I was doing my master's thesis. And I said, all my friends are using all this terminology and this jargon. Like, I know it. It just didn't feel natural to me to use it. And my thesis director said to me, well, if you can explain something that is complex in simple vocabulary, you understand it better than someone who can't do that. So again, if you have a large vocabulary, that's not a problem, but don't go using the thesaurus feature just to try to impress me, or think that that's what I'm looking for, because I'm not. I'm looking for clarity of thought. I'm looking for ideas. I'm looking that you understand what you read and what you've been researching. A big thing that you want to be on the lookout for too is repeated errors. A lot of times we have things that we do repeatedly that are just a weakness. Like, I know for me, I tend to overuse commas. I use Grammarly because it just saves me time. Like, I know, I could go back and edit and probably say, okay, I don't need this, I don't need that. But you can use things like Grammarly and other software to help you with editing and proofreading. You can also proofread backwards for spelling or grammar. If you have a problem with, if spelling is your weak point, like I know when we were growing up, my sister struggled with spelling. And that was just something that came naturally to me, unlike the commas. But you can proofread backwards if you would like. Read each sentence. Obviously, it's not going to help you with like grammar-wise, but it might help you with spelling. And then reading your paper aloud. I know this is something that nobody likes to do. I don't like to do it myself, but I've been editing for a long time, so I don't really need to. But I know that if if somebody reads it aloud to me, or if I work with someone in the writing center or whatever, that you hear those mistakes. Because they're not going to pause, right, if there's no comma, whereas you might because it's your sentence and you know what you were writing. So read your paper aloud or have someone read it aloud to you. A lot of times, things like maybe Google Docs, Microsoft Word, they might have something that will read it for you. That's up to you. When you're doing editing also, revising too, and this is just kind of a general rule of thumb, after you draft, wait a day. Don't wait till the last minute to do all of this because it's going to make your life miserable. Wait a day and then go back and look at it. That's what I do when I'm writing a paper. I always give myself, to sleep on it, so to speak, because then I'm coming back with fresh eyes and I might see something that, made sense while I was writing, but doesn't really actually make sense. Or a sentence that is awkwardly phrased. Because I'm going back and I'm reading it, with those fresh eyes. So keep that in mind too when you're doing this. Leave yourself time to work on this. Okay, so I just went over a lot of stuff. This one wasn't all that long compared to some of the other lectures, but we remember that revising and editing are different phases of the writing process. They take a lot of time. If you have your outline done, right, you do the outline, the drafting is actually the easiest part of writing the paper. The revising and editing take a lot more brain power than drafting does. And a lot of times for me, I spend a lot more time revising papers than I do actually putting my ideas down onto the paper. And again, depending on what type of assignment it is and how comfortable I am with the material, I might, if it's something I'm not comfortable with, I might revise a paper 2, 3, 4 times. Or if it's a style of paper I haven't written before. So just give yourself that time. Try not to wait till the last minute. I know that's a lot of students' inclination to do that, but try not to do that. And again, completing, revising, and editing as separate steps. It might take a little bit of practice to, not correct your commas and your spelling and your typos and things like that. That's at the end. Really take time to focus on those 4 higher order concerns. You can go back and rewatch this as many times as you need. You can take notes, you can take screenshots, whatever. But I want you to practice revising, waiting, and then editing. So if you have any questions, feel free to bring them to our next class. If not, I will see you there.